on a mission to give peaceful dialogue and peace a chance.
An absence of war is called peace. An absence of noise is also called peace. An absence of rattling guns is also sometimes called peace. But it's not.
Everywhere you look, there is persistent violent conflict.
We always just focus on peacemaking, but we are not focusing on peace building, which is a long-term process, because then another war is starting, attention is changing from that.
I hope that China, Xi Jinping will select not the militaristic way, but the peaceful way.
Welcome to the 5th edition of the WION Global Summit Mission Peace. It is the 16th of May 2022. Some 77 years ago, the month of May began with an announcement on the radio. It said Hitler had fallen, meaning the war is over. May 1945 marked the beginning of the end of the Second World War. 77 years later, May 2022 is the closest the world has ever come to another world war. As we speak, Ukraine and Russia are at war. There are armed conflicts in Syria, Libya, Mali, Colombia, Ethiopia. The world's biggest countries are fighting each other on trade. The world is also fighting a conflict called COVID. In the last couple of months, 6 million people have been displaced from their homes. 10 million people have lost a roof over their head. 1.7 billion people worldwide have been pushed to the brink of poverty and hunger, all because of conflict. We've seen 10 major armed conflicts since the Second World War, the likes of the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, and also the current war in Ukraine. Now, how do we explain these conflicts? 77 years since the Second World War, has the world still not figured out non-military alternatives to conflict resolution? We at WION are on a mission to give peaceful dialogue and peace a chance. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, a very warm welcome to all of you to this summit. We're calling it Mission Peace, the 5th edition of the WION Global Summit. Today, we will strive to chart preventive policies. We will vet possible options for sustainable peace. The idea behind this conclave is to give space to voices from across the political and ideological spectrum. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to flag off the first session of the day.
Casualties, fatalities, humanitarian crises, forced poverty, homelessness, orphaned infants, marching battalions, and tensions. All because of one red flag: armed conflict. Time to wave the white flag. Time to talk peace. Session 1. Waving the white flag on armed conflicts. And the dialogue partners for this session are Jane Hull-Lute, former Deputy Secretary of U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Yoshihide Nakayama, former State Minister of Defense, Japan. Marko Mikkelsen, the Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Estonian Parliament. Shah Mahmoud Miakhel, former Deputy Minister of Interior, Afghanistan. Moderating this session is WION's Managing Editor, Palki Sharma Upadhyay.
Welcome to the first session. I will start with Jane, and I think we can start by talking about the current war, the war in Ukraine that the whole world has been following almost 3 months now. Where do you think it's going? And a question that is often asked is this, that if Vladimir Putin started the war, do you think President Joe Biden is making sure that it doesn't end with his policies and decisions?
Thanks very much for having me. I think any conversation that's entitled Waving the White Flag on Conflict ought to begin by dispelling the myths that we have about violent conflict. One of the biggest myths about war is that it somehow happens in the passive voice. War breaks out. War is not the weather. And we act very often like it is. Oh, it's going to rain. Oh, war is going to break out. War is not the weather. Another myth is that poor people kill each other. Rich people will kill each other too. Another myth is that conflict might be religious or ethnic. It tells us why people might be different. It doesn't tell us anything about why they've decided to kill each other over those differences. The war going on in Ukraine didn't break out. It was launched by Vladimir Putin with the aim, with his stated aims of erasing Ukraine from the map. He's not succeeding.
Who is?
I don't know that anyone is succeeding at the moment. I think the Ukrainians are putting up a remarkable, brave, and determined defense of their country. And I think as long as a single Ukrainian draws breath, that will continue to be the case.
And since we are focusing on the active voice, who, like I asked in the first question, is making sure that this war does not see a conclusion?
Yeah, I think there are no straight lines in war. We know who started this war. None of us are very sure how it ends.
Marco Mikkelsen, who should take the onus of trying to ensure that this war ends? And I could rephrase this question and say, who is profiting from this war? The criticism has been that if this war was triggered by Vladimir Putin's desire to recreate the Soviet Union, NATO's expansionism also must take some part of the blame.
I can say I know who will win this war. The peace will win this war, but Ukrainians and Ukraine and their territorial integrity and sovereignty will be preserved and totally anchored in the future world order. Otherwise, if this world will end differently, what I mentioned right now, we all are going to be victims. Estonia, as a small nation, understand very well that peace can have two faces, at least. You started today our session telling that in May 1945, World War II ended. For our nation, this wasn't the end of a war. It was start of occupation for more than 50 years. And for Estonia and other Baltic states and a number of other nations, actually World War II ended only at the end of Soviet Empire, Soviet Union, 1991. Last occupational forces left Estonia only in 1994. And this regard, for us, the lesson what we learned from this tragic history was that as a small nation, we have to invest into cooperation with our nation who very much value a rule-based world order, that all the nations, small or big, are committed to what they have agreed upon internationally, on the level of the United Nations or other organizations. Multilateralism is something what is our mantra, of course. And then you ask about NATO. I totally disagree with the view that NATO, there is existing some sort of NATO expansionism. NATO can't expand if those people who would like to join this alliance of defensive alliance are not ready or not willing to join. Think about Finland and Sweden today, who make historic step in their history, asking their leaders to join this defense alliance. And this is the case again, and we see that why they do this. They understand that only the way to preserve peace, stability for Northern Europe, for their nation, is to work closely together with other nations who very much share the same values and understanding what peace means and how to preserve peace.
Well, that's what politicians say. It's about values. There's a lot of politics as well. You said that NATO is an alliance against a threat. From what I understand, the raison d'etre of NATO was to take on the Soviet Union or to check the threat from the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union ceased to exist, why did NATO expand?
NATO, once again, NATO didn't expand because just this was something against somebody. Unfortunately, as a journalist, I worked in Moscow in the mid-90s, and I witnessed myself covering First Chechen War that actually the end of Soviet Union didn't mean the end of colonial and imperial Russia. The threat was there. Threat was imminent from very beginning of those years actually, and we felt as neighbors. And this is why we sought the security and defense from allies who can keep this to us as a democratic small nation on a border with imperial Russia. And as long Russia goes on with its colonial and imperial policy, not only neighborhood is not safe and in peace, but also entire world, because this is what President Putin is doing right now against Ukraine. This is war against the world order, what we all would like to see be preserved.
Yasuhide Nakayama, how do you see the war in Ukraine? And I understand that your country and your party have been pushing for Japan to drop its pacifist approach. Do you think arms are a guarantee against wars?
Okay, thank you. Before I'm beginning answering your question, I would like to say thank you, Mr. CEO Sudhir, to inviting me far away from Japan, paying air ticket and very comfortable hotel. Thank you. But I'm very uncomfortable with this chair. For the Japanese people, it's too, high. So make it lower next time. And also my English skill is not so good. I learn English by myself from Hollywood movies called Beverly Hills Cop 1. So my English is a little bit rough sometimes, but I'd like to say sorry at the beginning. So, and also I'd like to say, UAE citizens, I really respect your attitude to your own president. He just passed away. I send my condolences, His Highness Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan. He opened this country, and as Sudhir-san said, His Excellencies established a distinguished work. We, the Japanese people, really respect his dignity. So thank you again, and listening my beginning speech. So I'd like to answer your question. So the Mr. answered about the Estonia vision. But from Far East, how I can see the Russians' activity. 1945, 15th of August, the war ends. We, the Japan, surrender. And the emperor announced we surrender. But just after the war ends, Russia, the former Soviet Union, they invade and they took our northern territory island. And 70 years later now, they're still occupying our island. And they're upgrading lots of military facilities, lots of nuclear submarines, and they still doing real active military activities around my country. And especially last year, we had the election for House of Representatives, but just right beginning of the week, they exercising lots of, very aggressive military activity just right in front of the Pacific Ocean. Of course, Russian people said, and the politician says, in Japan, there is a United States bases, and they might have nuclear weapons. And do you remember, Japanese people? The US drop atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, how do I answer to the Russians? Yes, of course, we never forget the atomic bombs. But President Obama came to my country, Hiroshima, and he prayed for the victims of the war. And we also went to Honolulu, Hawaii, because we fight against the United States. And we bombed to the Pearl Harbor. Of course, this is a history. And but please remember, we, the Japan and the United States, when we started the reconciliation, this is the start and the beginning of the war time. At the beginning of the war, we already started to get to know each other. And now, the 21st century, we, the Japan and the United States, is the most strong allies and the most trustable friends, I think, all over the world. And we are now challenging and tackling the difficulty issues in front of us. And we, the Japan, try to make a strong strengthening during the FOIP, Free, Open Indo-Pacific. And especially the WION exists in India. India has, of course, a neutral policy, but historically, India, also Japan, is a very good friend. And we are, the friends of Quad. So I hope the Russians' neighbor is not just the Europeans. The Russian neighbor is also just Far East. The Japanese also have lots of fear and threat watching through this conflict and the invasion on Ukraine by the Russians.
Right. Yes, I think all neighbors of Russia and also the countries that depend on Russia feel the impact of the war. And the world is such today that a conflict or a war in any remote part of the world impacts everyone, which is why we are seeing inflation, and that's another security challenge. Food security has been threatened. Shah Mahmood Miakhil, you've seen war from various vantage points. You've been a reporter, you've been part of various UN bodies, and then you were a policymaker in Afghanistan. In this day and age, what do you think drives countries to fight military conflicts? Why do you think conversations fail? And while I'm asking you a question, I also want to ask, since you've seen Afghanistan and the way Afghanistan has suffered the consequences of a war, do you think Ukraine is going down the same road?
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning to everyone, and also thank you for the invitation, and also I extend my condolences to the people of the UAE and the government by the death of their president, which has happened recently. Yes, in the last 50 years, which is a half a century, I have seen firsthand all kinds of war in Afghanistan. Occupation, intervention, civil war, proxy wars, war on terror, whatever you just call it. And everyone, including myself, my family, we are victims of this war. We lost our friends. So, in conclusion, I can say is there is no good or bad war. There is no good and bad terrorist. War is war, and as Churchill was saying, jaw is better than war. Always we have to prevent the wars. That is more important things. Once the war has happened, you violate all kinds of laws, human rights, and the average people, women and children, they will suffer. So the war in Afghanistan still has not ended. We are still in war. We don't know how this war will expand or will end. What will be the consequences of this war to the region and beyond the region? Because still, one thing's really bothered me. Most of the politicians or decision makers, their talks and walks are not the same. For example, in the case of Afghanistan, we were just fighting against terrorism, Al-Qaeda. But the leader of Al-Qaeda was in Pakistan. But the family of Al-Qaeda is living in Iran, the bin Laden. So that was the reason, unless the governments of all nations, especially our neighbors in our region, if they support the non-state actors as a policy to destabilize other countries, I think the war will not end, because the war will change from state to state war, which is already happening in Ukraine. We have seen it, but there is, the war which is non-state actor, which is, they are more dangerous to Afghanistan and also to the region. In order to prevent wars and solve the wars, when I say why we cannot end the war in Afghanistan soon, because still we don't have a space for dialogue. How to reshape the future of Afghanistan. The same group, Taliban, they will control, which they deprived the women, children, and others. They don't have a constitution. They don't believe on laws. They prevent education and everything. Or it will be expanded to the region also. So to prevent the wars in the future, we have to send our mindset. We have to, which is mentioned before, we have to have a sincere dialogues to create a mechanism for bring peace and stability. Invest in the peace process, especially invest in education, good governance, and poverty in others, because otherwise we will have another generation of extremism which will emerge. Because when I say 50 years in Afghanistan, I am the fourth generation. My father, myself, my children, my grandchildren, we are in this war. Because of the wrong policies in 80s, we are suffering now. If we make a wrong policies, forget or ignore the problem in Afghanistan, we have a pet in the next 10, 15 years. So that was the reason is we have to invest on the peace and also prevent the wars. Like nowadays, preventive medicine is better to curative, or restorative justice is better than punitive justice. So preventing war is more important than to have a peace, because when you destroy everything, then you just say, okay, let's have a peace. So yes, that is important to prevent the war. We have a saying, you cannot wash blood with blood. Then you should have a peace. Like you gave a good example from Japan. Yes, war has happened, but now you have a peace, you have a good relation. This should be a model for our neighbors, for the regions, and also to the world. Thank you.
As Mr. Chaudhary also said, that the absence of war is not peace. It takes a lot more to build peace. And Afghanistan, I think, is the perfect example. The war is technically over, but there is no peace. Jane, we are sitting in Dubai, and this region is home to some of the world's most intractable conflicts. The Israel-Palestine conflict is one. And even after the Abraham Accords, one sees that the fault lines tend to resurface. The latest one over the killing of a journalist, a very unfortunate incident. The Yemen conflict is far from resolved. Syria is very much in the throes of violence. What will it take for these wars to end? And these are all wars that have no winners.
I think we will send ourselves all to the depths of despair. Everywhere you look, there is persistent violent conflict. It seems true that not one of the major monotheistic traditions in the world today can control its fringes, its fanatics, not one. Indeed, what we see increasingly are leaders speaking to the fringes to foment violence, hatred, a disregard for other human beings. And we see it everywhere. This certainly is a region beset by conflict, but no region is free of it. How do these end? Why do they end when they do? What factors combine to prevent wars from ending? Is there a political economy of war where people are profiteering from the persistent violence? Of course there is. How do we recognize the signs that peace building has taken hold? We think we know what they are intellectually, right? We think they're representative governance, broadly representative governance, right? Economic opportunity for as many as possible, and robust civil society based on the rule of law. So those three attributes are pretty uncontroversial. We think they're characteristics of a capable society. And what's the sign? Is it elections? I don't think so. I don't think elections are a sign of almost anything, really. When a government can collect non-coerced revenues from its citizens that reinvested in the country, that's a little more of a durable sign. So what will it take? I only know one thing that would take us out of a toxic cycle, whether it's a toxic political cycle or a toxic violent cycle, and that's for winners to be generous. And it's proving difficult today.
I agree. Yasuvita Nakayama, there's another conflict that the world is bracing itself for in the region that we call home. China has been practicing the invasion of Taiwan and practicing the invasion and spelling it out in so many words. Do you think that is where the next threat will be? And do you think that there is now the political will to stop misadventures of this nature?
I think this is a very important question because, as Afghanistan gentleman said, before peace building, if the next war begins, what's happening? I mean, it's turn it over again and again. So, for example, all the worldwide media only focusing on Ukraine border now. But how about the Myanmar, Burma? There is also doing some unhuman rights activities from the strong military government. And so what about the Taiwan Strait? So after Ukraine situation, invasion by Russians, if the China learn, if the Xi Jinping is smart, I don't think he's going to try to invade Taiwan. But there is, of course, a possibility, and there is some luck. I think he's thinking the two ways. One is a peaceful way. The other one is forcing by the military action. I mean, the Chinese PLA. And which option he's going to choose is, I think it depends on the world leader of the superpower is, which is the United States of America. With the President Biden's administration, if the Xi Jinping think until the Biden's administration is continuously or suddenly stopped by the democracy of the United States citizens, American citizens, before the Biden over, or even after Biden, the China try to do action within that point, the time of the period. So this is one of the way of thinking by I think the Chinese, some high position people. But once, if they try to invade Taiwan and Japan is really close geopolitically, only 110 kilometers, the closest point. So Chinese military already calculated inside of the AZIS, anti-denial air, defense region, including our nation. So once war begins against Taiwan, I think the Japan, and also there is Okinawa Island, which has the U.S. military exists. So the U.S. and Japan have to, the China tried to involve with the two countries. So I hope that the China, Xi Jinping will select not the militaristic way, but the peaceful way. So that is my personal opinion.
Well, in hope we all live, Before the Ukraine war began, we all said that logic dictates that this is just posturing and Vladimir Putin is not going to invade, but we saw how that played out. But Marco, I would want you to weigh in on this, and do you believe that the world is going to actively make moves to ensure that another invasion/war does not happen, and it's difficult to sanction Russia as it is. It's going to be a lot more difficult to decouple from China.
This is extremely important topic, and to ask what shall be done in order to avoid further wars, or like you mentioned, the possibility of China to attack Taiwan. I am pretty much sure that President Xi Jinping following very closely what's happening in the war of Russia against Ukraine, and also how the world reacts to this. In terms of sanctions, but also in terms of global activity on the level of United Nations, for instance. So it really matters a lot if Ukraine will win this war. And actually, I don't know, is this your intentional sort of secret here on a stage, to have a colors which resemble to me Ukrainian flag, blue and yellow, or if not, then it's it's good to see at least that we're sitting here in under these kind of colors, because it really connects us to the much more peaceful world. Because if Ukraine can sustain as a democracy, as a country with territorial integrity and sovereignty, then this gives the signal to anyone that the war, what they can launch, will get international response. International response that actually prevents perhaps other leaders to try to do the same. But this is, in order to achieve this, we have today to really put a lot of energy, international, diplomatic, also military, in terms sending weaponry to Ukraine for their brave fight for their freedom. And from that depends very much in which kind of world we will live tomorrow.
Right. I think one of the reasons why the world goes into conflict, if I may, is also because too much power rests in the hands of a handful of people, and they dictate policies and politics. I remember reading a very interesting story that involves Japan and the US, and you mentioned the attack. And back then, the US Secretary of War, they had a list of the cities in Japan that were to be bombed, and Kyoto was on the list. And this gentleman had been to Kyoto on his honeymoon, and so he'd seen the rich culture and beauty of the city, and so he struck off Kyoto and he put Nagasaki there. And it was a very telling story, because it shows you how some people and their whims and fancies can seal the fate of millions of people. I think, as you said, we need more inclusion in decision making, and that is one way to end conflict, at least theoretically. I think that would be a good point to end on. Thank you very much.
Trade sanctions are taking the world by storm. At least 20,000 sanctions are currently active. The result? A downturn in the global economy. A disruption in global supply chains. A world bracing for growing inflation. In times of globalization, are there any winners in trade wars? Session 3, Trade Wars, no long-term winners. And the dialogue partners for this session are Pat Breen. He is Ireland's former Minister for Trade and Business. Simon Lacey, former Vice President, Huawei. Wasika Ayesha Khan, Member of Parliament, Bangladesh. Richie Santos Diaz, Senior Strategic Advisor of the Corporate Group. Moderating this session is WION's Managing Editor, Palki Sharma Upadhyay.
Welcome to the session. And we have Wasika joining us from Bangladesh. Padreen, I want to begin with you. You're an expert in the field of trade and commerce. And my question to you is this. Would you say that trade wars are spelling the end of globalization?
Good morning, good afternoon, I suppose at this stage to everybody, and to say, good afternoon to everybody, and thank you, Palki, for the introduction. Can I first of all, like the previous speakers, I think I'm one of the first Irish ex-ministers to address this forum, just to sympathise with the people of UAE on the death of Sheikh Khalifa and to wish new President Mohammed every good success. Before I start, can I just say to you, Palki, the relationship between Ireland and India is very strong, not just in relation to the colour of our flags, but also the former Prime Minister and incoming Prime Minister will come in at the end of the year. Leo Varadkar, his father is from India, was a doctor from India, and so I think when the new Prime Minister takes over again with those Indian connections, it'll further strengthen the relations between Ireland and India. To answer your question, I suppose, in relation to globalisation is really important. I think it will continue. I think the trade wars that are ongoing at the moment, they will have to be resolved, the disputes in some way or another. I mean, we saw in 2018 when Donald Trump, put tariffs on goods coming in from Europe to the US, and the issues that were going to happen as a result of that, particularly in relation to Boeing and Airbus, who are two competitors, one from Europe and one from the US, and of course the steel tariffs as well. And, this was going to cause huge disruption for the whole European community. And the European community is a big bloc of countries together, nearly 500 million people. And, this dispute was going to harm the relationship because Europe exports about 24% of their goods into the US. So the US is a very important trading partner. And as a result of this, and as a result of dialogue, with the formation of the Technology and Craft Council, we were able to, this was a council that was elected by the various two countries with high-level both ministers and secretaries of state from the US and trade representatives on this. They were able to deter those sanctions and put them off. So you can see yourself, dialogue is extremely important when you're dealing with trade wars. Trade wars, the reality is, there may be short-term winners in trade wars, but in the end, it's the people that you're trying to protect that will lose most in this. So no, I don't think it's the end of globalization. Maybe, when Donald Trump, said that he wanted to make America great again, I think that's impossible in today's modern world because, companies that invest abroad, and Ireland is the home of many pharma companies. From it has one of the, I suppose, 20 of the top 20 pharma companies in the world are based in Ireland, and they're there for one reason. Donald Trump at the time said these companies must come back to America so as to create jobs. But it doesn't work like that because these companies are in Ireland for a number of reasons. First of all, to serve the European market, which is a very large market. So no, I think it's not the end of globalization. There are going to be blips, I suppose, all the way through, as we've seen down through the years in relation to trade wars. We saw what happened in the Great Depression back in the 30s. And what happened there was, People were afraid that imports were going to, people were going to lose their jobs. And so they put tariffs in place. And those tariffs eventually led to huge inflation, which, we talked about there earlier. And as a result of that, down the road came the World War II. So we have to learn from the lessons of the past, but it's difficult. But I think the word relationship is going to be really important during our debate here today, because relationships with countries, diplomatic relationships, economic relationships are extremely important if we're to ensure to end trade wars and, of course, to ensure that we don't end globalisation, which is really important for small open countries like Ireland, where we produce enough of food to feed 35 million people with a population ourselves of 5 million people. So we have to get our goods off the island, and it's only by trade and by having partners in trade and relationships that we can continue to do that in the future.
Simon, you've been the Vice President of Huawei, which is, whether we like it or not, the market leader in 5G, and many countries are trying to protect their interests by raising concerns about their links with the Chinese government. Every time there is a trade war or the threat of a trade war, leaders tend to sell the concept of self-sufficiency. But in this interlinked and interdependent world, is it possible for countries to be completely self-sufficient to insulate themselves from the threat of a trade war?
I lived in Switzerland for many years, and Switzerland has this incredibly protectionist agricultural policy. And I remember somebody said once, in Switzerland they could grow pineapples if they wanted to, but they would just be 15 times more expensive than the pineapples that they could import from Taiwan or Hawaii or wherever, just because they'd have to grow them all in greenhouses, and so it'd be ridiculously expensive. And the other thing I think you have to remember, going back to the point that Pat made about globalisation, and this sort of ties into what I'm saying about comparative advantage and absolute advantage. I mean, globalisation is not over because the economic rationales for globalisation are still very much there, and there's just too much money to be made by integrating these markets, and so yes, we will see some sort of limited decoupling in areas of sort of sensitive technologies and data. We're starting to see that as big Chinese technology companies are being forced to delist from the US stock exchange, and as we're seeing Huawei, for example, run into some serious headwinds in the US and in some other markets. But basically, globalization is not over. It's just going through a sort of realignment as countries sort of think about how deeply integrated do they want to be with certain countries. I think, deeper integration is really only going to be possible and is only going to be desirable with countries that you share a number of values with. And I think that's really where globalization is headed. It's more of a sort of values alignment rather than a full-scale decoupling.
Interesting. Wasika Aisha Khan, we are saying the title of the session is Trade Wars, No Long-Term Winners, and I'm curious to know if you agree with this, because there seem to be some winners. When China and the US were engaged or have been engaged in a trade war at the peak of it, I understand a lot of garment manufacturers especially that worked with China were looking at opportunities in Bangladesh. So would you say that your country has been a beneficiary of some sort of trade wars?
Thank you, Palki. It's a pleasure to join the Global Summit. I've always admired the WION team since its inception. I offer my heartfelt condolences to the people of United Arab Emirates and wish their new leader well. Trade wars, in my opinion, are not sustainable. And if you're talking about beneficiaries of trade war, the supply and demand will actually decide which country is the best producer of a certain commodity. And Bangladesh has always been competitive in the RMG sector. And we are number 2 in exporting RMG, as you know. So the trade war between US and China may benefit somewhat, but it will not make a sea change in Bangladesh's economy. like, self-reliance versus international trade has occupied the center stage of political and academic debates for most of the 20th century. Now we are talking of trade wars and sanctions in the new global scenario. But during the pandemic, we did face much supply chain disruption, and we learned to cope with that. When we are talking about sanctions and protectionism, ultimately who suffers? I think the consumer suffers the most. And for a developing economy like Bangladesh's, the burden of tariff subsidies, protection subsidies, and sanctions will be ultimately borne by the consumer. In any other nation, it's the same case. The price of the products produced rises by the amount of tariff or protectionism or sanctions or whatever is the reason on the import of similar goods. So this is essentially a transfer of resources from the consumer to the producer. So by sanctioning products and by picking up trade wars with certain nations, how are we being fair to the consumer, the biggest stakeholder in the economy? And how environmentally friendly is a trade war? What about the carbon footprints? And this is, I don't think it's going to be, my personal opinion, it's not going to be sustainable.
Right. So we've spoken about policymakers, we've spoken about the consumers whose interests must be safeguarded at all times. As a representative of global business, how do you account for the possibility of a trade war at a time when there are obvious supply chain disruptions, at a time when there is a lot of talk of recessionary pressures on economies the world over? How do companies deal with these decisions and changes?
Yeah, so, can you hear that? Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, like everybody else in this room, I'm a resident now of Dubai, so my condolences as well. And my colleagues here who had different kind of points of view in terms of, from a policy point of view, from a government point of view, from a multinational point of view, with regards to kind of the everyday consumer, when you kind of asked the audience earlier, you said how many have seen inflation from a consumer point of view, right? And we don't, as the average person, whether it be a business or a person, you don't actually think about, what's going on in terms of, this government, they're going to put 25% tariffs on China. You're thinking about how to survive, right? You're thinking about, from a business point of view, as well as from a consumer point of view. And it's what you were saying earlier, the consumer price index in the United States, it was the highest in March in 40 years. It was 8.5%. So from a business point of view and from a consumer point of view, you see these costs, they add up. One, for example, the pandemic. I think it's not even the pandemic, but the Suez Canal, right? I think that taught a lot of businesses, a lot of governments in terms of, oh my God, I'm so reliant on, say, China, for example. I mean, 8 out of the 10 largest ports in the world, busiest, are actually in China, if you count Hong Kong as well. So as a business, for example, maybe if you're exporting, if you're developing goods and let's say 70% of it is coming from China, you start thinking, and many have started doing this, how do I diversify my supply chain, where it's not solely coming from one specific port, maybe near Shanghai, that maybe it's coming from other sources, maybe from Bangladesh, as you were saying earlier, in terms of other countries, Vietnam, Bangladesh have been emerging, where China is actually becoming so expensive now that actually they are benefiting from these developments, and businesses are seeing that, right? They rather than, pay, with the increase of costs, I'm going to get my stuff from Bangladesh, or I'm going to get my stuff from Vietnam, because it's much cheaper, it diversifies, it mitigates my risk. You always want to mitigate your risk as a business. And I think it's not even just that I'll twist it a bit and then add digital transformation, right? I think all of us in the pandemic, I mean, hands up in Dubai in this audience, we're using online shopping more than you were prior, right? My Amazon account just went like, woof. So literally, you know, as a business as well, I think the word for this year is the I word, inflation. You know, we've all said, like I said, the CPI in the US was the highest in 40 years. And businesses obviously are thinking about this. You know, in the US, it's hard to get baby formula at the moment apparently. So as a business, you know, to answer your question, you start thinking about it, you know, from your cash flow, from where you're sourcing your supplies, your talent, and in terms of digital transformation, where the pandemic accelerated that, I think also even where your staff are working, in terms of how that is, where actually, do I have to be in the same city? Can they be working in Bangladesh or Ireland? And I'm doing it all here.